This video is going to be a bit of an introduction to how I've been using oil paints. And I'm also going to touch the subject of pigments. We usually in the miniature painting world, community, really stick to sort of acrylic paints. There's all these brands about, and they all have different qualities, and some are thick and some are thin, and all these things. But we never really talk much about other types of paint, and therefore I want to just introduce oil paints and pigments. The thing with oil paints is that if you've already painted your miniature with acrylic paints, sort of your regular mini paints from Citadel or Vallejo or wherever, if you paint oil paints on top of that, it doesn't really interfere with the acrylic. Like, you can wash it off or you can smudge it around, and it doesn't really affect what you've already done with the acrylic. And that's sort of the basis of how I've been using or testing out oil paints, and I wanted to show you how I've been doing it. It's sort of adding shadows, adding dirt, adding grime, things like that. And I really like the oil paints because they don't dry very fast. We're used to paint that dries really fast. You sort of have to, if you wet blend or anything like that, you sort of have to have quite the tempo. Whereas oil paints, they take ages to dry, and so they're very forgiving to work with. And it's really nice, the result is nice, but it's also a nice change of tempo when working on a miniature and not having to stress. Something I do want to mention about oil paints is obviously, well, to you maybe not obviously, but it's not soluble in water. They're oil-based. I think these are based from it's linseed oil and pigment. I think probably some other things as well. But to clean your brush and things like that, you need to use white spirit. Or, if you're into the model world, you can sort of buy Humbrol's thinner, which is basically expensive white spirit. And that's what you need to clean your brush, to dilute the paints and things like that. And it can be kind of smelly. There are unsmellable versions. This is one example. It's called sans odeur, which I guess is French for no smell or something. So it's basically sort of like another chemical type of white spirit, but it just doesn't smell. But it's still, there's still, I'm not going to say a hazard, but you have to be aware of that. You're starting to use chemicals and other things in your process that aren't water-based, and therefore, you're starting to have chemicals around your house. If you have kids, you need to up your game in sort of safety. Like, for me, the only downside with oil paints is like sort of the cleaning bit is a bit more of a, it's another step than just having water that you can sort of pour down the drain. And that's the only sort of downside to oil paints I can think of. So let's get to the point of what I want to show you. I've got this dwarf cannon that you might have seen before. And by the way, if you are new to this channel is mainly about me trying things out. Obviously I practice every now and again, but I'm by no means an expert. So these minis where you see me using oil paint in this video is pretty much the first time I play around with oil paints. I've been doing it some more since then, but I don't want to disencourage you by saying, this is really difficult. Well, it's not really, because this is the first time I try it. So back to the dwarf cannon. I've got this cannon and a dwarf crew, and it was all sort of painted and done with acrylics. I've put quite a lot of effort into, getting them nice, but I was still feeling that I myself have a bit of a difficulty doing the sort of, that the shaded areas are more shaded. My miniatures tend to be sort of just the one, if you want to call it, tone all over. Like under the arms, it's nice if it's a little bit darker, and like in crevices and in between the legs. Sounds, yeah. In my world, it should be a bit darker, but I'm not really all that good at sort of doing that with acrylics. I sort of get carried away and just use the same technique all over, and then I've got a very uniform painted miniature. So I figured I was going to try these oil paints to use sort of like a shade. Just try and get it sort of in the darker areas. So I mixed this burnt umber with a purple. It's called dioxazine purple. Sort of 50-50. You might be wondering, purple? Well, because I'm using this in sort of the shaded areas, I wanted to have sort of a cold tone, and so I went for purple. And the burnt umber is really, really dark. It's a very dark brown. So I'm sort of staying away from black, because the black is basically very, very black, and I don't want it to be pitch black. If you want pitch black, if you want to try this thing out, go ahead. But I mixed these two 50-50. I then added a little bit of my white spirit, basically Humbrol thinner is what I'm using because I had some, and just a tad, just to make it a little bit more liquidy. So the first thing I tried this out on was this wheel on the Canon, because basically, it was just the one sort of shade of grey wood, and I wanted it to be sort of darker down towards the ground, but also, maybe add a bit of a dirt feeling. And so I just smeared it on, and then I cleaned my brush off and dipped it in a bit of white spirit and sort of wiped it, most of it off on a piece of tissue. And then I just started to work a gradient in the edge of the paint. And that's the thing with oil paint. This is sort of what it's made for. Well, probably not really, but it's really easy to make gradients like this. If you put the paint on, clean your brush, add some more white spirit to the brush. Maybe, you might need to wash some off, because if you might remove too much paint if you have too much white spirit. But working these gradients, sort of going from 0 to 100% in a nice gradient, is really, really easy compared to acrylic paints. So this is where this technique sort of really shines, and it looks really good, really fast. But let's pause there for a minute, because I know it's a bit difficult to see with the video material. So and I have pictures, but I don't really have before and after pictures. But if we look at this wheel, basically the center of the wheel, which is gray, that was the shade that was over the entire wheel. And so the darker parts and the sort of bit browner parts around the edges, that's the oil paint. And you can also see that, which is, I'm still practicing this, but when you paint the oil paint on, it looks darker than it does when it's dried. And, that's a thing that you can only learn by experience of, trying this a few times, is, what do things look like when they're dry? I can't tell you. You're going to have to try and see by yourself. But I guess eventually, this is my first time with oil paints, and I guess after a while, this is the kind of stuff that you learn. So the wheel now looks sort of, it's got a bit more of a shade, it's got more character, it's got a bit more of a grime. The gradient is really nice, and, let me tell you that this was a very fast procedure compared to sort of layer painting or wet blending, acrylics, which is what you would have had to do to get this effect otherwise. But let's have a look at the same technique on a miniature. And so I used it on all the 3 dwarves out of the crew for the Canon, and pretty much smeared on wherever there should be more shade, like under the arms facing down, sort of in between the legs, on the base, where there would have been a shadow from the miniature, all these different places. And I used the same mixture with the brown and the purple, and smeared it on, and then sort of tried to work some nice sort of gradients going with my brush, with some white spirit on it. And, same thing here as with the wheel. In my opinion, it turns out really nice, and is really surprisingly simple. We can pause here as well and just look at a photograph, because I know it's difficult to see, so what's the oil paint and what's the acrylic paint? But you see the sort of the gradient on the hand, that was just, the hand was one tone, one shade. It was the same kind of tone on the tip of the fingers as sort of underneath here. But now I've got this sort of nice gradient going, and and that's the same thing all over the miniatures. All these sort of shaded areas and the nice gradients. That's just all oil paint. That's pretty much my brief introduction to, I think, a nice place to start with oil paints, because I think you should be trying oil paints out. And especially in this manner, you don't need to jump in and start to paint the miniature entirely off of oil paint. You're more than welcome to, but this is a nice starting point, especially if you're like me. I mean, I'm not a beginner anymore, but I'm no expert, and especially getting these shades going and things like that. I find this procedure really simple. And I mean, you don't have to use brown and purple. You can use any tones you want, and you can go in the other direction as well and add, whatever colors anywhere. But I think a really nice place to start is to paint your miniature first with acrylics, and then sort of add character to it with oil paints. Or anywhere where you sort of want a gradient kind of a thing going, which is also very difficult, in my opinion, with acrylics. And it takes a lot of effort, whereas this could potentially be a very fast way of working. And you might be asking yourself, well, why didn't you just use a wash? If you want, a darker color in the shaded areas, why not use a wash? Well, for one thing, a wash really just sticks into the smallest crevices. It also affects wherever it ends up. If you use a blue wash on sort of a gray, then wherever you stick that brush down, that gray is going to turn into a blue gray, even if it's a raised part. With the oil paint, I can just clean that off. Wherever I don't want it, I can clean it off with a white spirit. It also gives me more time. Like a wash is like you smear on and then I need to, step away from the brush and look at your miniature dry. Whereas here, you can just, fiddle around with it for quite some time and get some nice gradients going. And that's the thing as well with a wash. I mean, it's sort of a gradient, but it's mainly dark in the really deepest crevices. Whereas here, you can just sort of get a gradual gradient going all over the surface and not just in the crevices. So the downsides to oil paints, I mentioned one, which is, you have to use the white spirit. It smells. It's more of a hassle cleaning your brush, or, because you end up with white spirit that's dirty, and what do you do with it? Well, maybe you need to go and recycle it somewhere, or, whatever. The other downside is, well, you need to buy a new set of paint, I guess. But you don't honestly need all that many, especially if you try it out for some time and you go like, well, I just want brown and purple for all my shadows. Well, then you just need a brown and a purple. It's not like you need the entire palette. And oil paints are, surprisingly easy as well to mix. You basically just need a few base colors and you can mix. Like, you don't need to buy an orange. You can buy yellow and red and so forth. It also takes quite some time to dry. So, that could be seen as a downside if you want. If you want to try this out, do the oil paint sort of as the last step. I'm not sure, there's no problem putting oil paint on an acrylic. I don't know how it ends up the other way around. If you do want to paint more acrylic on top of the oil paint, I think it's a good idea to make sure that, you've left the miniature for a day or so that the oil paint really has dried. Because if the oil paint isn't dry and it is still shrinking and contracting while it's drying, and you put an acrylic on there which dries faster, then it might crack. I don't know, I'm making this up. But, it's a reasonable thought. And then I mentioned I was going to talk about pigments, and you might be wondering, well, you just talked about oil paints, why talk about pigments in the same video? Well, for me, this entire video is sort of more about trying to, inspire a little bit in moving, trying other things out than just the acrylic paints. There's lots of different types of things that can colorize your miniature, and it's not just acrylic paints. And I did use both the oil paint and pigments on this, Canon project. So I figured, I'll show both of the techniques to you, because the end result is a combination of all these parts. But most of all, just an introduction to other things than acrylic paints. I should really sort of start maybe reading about stuff before I talk about them, but I don't. But I'm guessing, because of the word pigment, that's exactly what this is. Basically, all paints have a pigment in them, and then other things to make it fluid. Whereas a pigment is just the pigment. It's a dry powder, so nothing fluid going on here at all. And so one of the things with pigments is that they're really strong, if you want to call them that. If you put some pigment, especially like if you take some of this black and dust it on your miniature, it goes black and it stays black. So that's one of the things about pigments. But why use pigments? Well, because it's powder, it also acts like powder. It sort of acts like dust. And when you use a wet paint, like in normal acrylic, and say, like in my case that I'm going to show you, is I have the end of the barrel on the cannon. It should be black. There's, gunpowder and cannonballs and stuff whooshing out of it, and obviously it goes black. And I could paint that black, but it would sort of look more like I've just painted black on there. Whereas a pigment, it sort of acts like gunpowder dust, and so it really looks like gunpowder dust. Same goes for something like this, which is called dry mud, which I sometimes use just sort of as, because it's pretty light, sort of like dust on a base, or like on the legs of a miniature, because they've been walking through the desert. And it really looks like dust. It doesn't look like I've just tried to double on some light brown paint on the legs. And, so it's like, why did you just smear paint all over the legs? It looks like dust. This is a rust, dark red ochre, actually. So that means not rust, that means dry red earth. But it could be used as sort of rust, dust, stains, but also same thing here, like if you've got sort of a red base, a desert sort of ochre base, just sort of dusting some of this on the legs of the miniature, it really looks like dust. And that's the reason why you should be using pigments, in my humble opinion, is wherever you want something to look dusty or dust-like, why not use something that is already dust? So on these dwarf cannon miniatures, as I said, I used it on the end of the barrel. I also put some of the black underneath. I realized the cannon, because I painted the base first and I put the cannon on there, and it was kind of strange, like there was no shade from the cannon. And so I added some black pigment just to make it sort of darker. And there's this fellow holding a cannonball, and he had really clean hands. And I figured, his hands should not be clean. So I added some black pigment, just a little bit. And now his hands look sort of a really nice, dirty kind of feeling. And then on the bases, I used this sort of dry mud. And once more, this is when the miniatures are completely finished, because, I was saying I put some dust on the bases. It looks like sort of dry earth, kind of a dust thing on the wheels of the cannon, all these sort of small things that just adds character and it makes everything look fun, you know. But pigments, you should be putting this on at the absolute end of your, you know, you're done, and then you add pigments. The thing with pigments is once you've got it all in place, you're sort of happy with what it looks like. But you'll notice that if you put your finger on it, you can still sort of smear it out and rub it off. And that's the thing. It's just a powder. It doesn't have anything to make it sort of stick and harden. So first and foremost, pigments is what you should be doing at the absolute end of painting your mini, because you can't really go in and start painting acrylics on top of the pigment. It'll, you know, the pigment will mix with your acrylic paint. So if you paint a brown on there and you've got some of this red pigment, you'll end up with the red brown, you know, and all the pigment will just smear out. So you should be doing the pigments last. What you can do to get these pigments to sort of stick in place a little bit better is to use white spirit and just drip, or like I use my brush, I, you know, try and soak it in white spirit and just lightly touch wherever I have the pigment, and that'll sort of flow out on top of the pigment and make it stick in place. That'll also give you a good idea what things look like, because same thing with pigments is usually they can look a lot more vibrant while you're working, but once you put sort of your white spirit on there, you might realize that you need to add a bit more pigment. And in the end, to make sure that this doesn't smear anywhere, you're going to have to varnish your miniature. If you use pigments, I definitely recommend you to varnish the miniature when you're done. And so that was my first introduction to oil paints and pigments, just to sort of see if, you know, I can help out broaden your horizons a bit more. I'm definitely going to be using oil paints and pigments a lot more in the future, so there will probably be more videos where this is featured. But this is a first step. Bye.